Thomas Jefferson said that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. The opposite of vigilance is heedlessness, the lack of vigilance. The following is a transcript from a video presentation that I've taken the liberty to edit and paraphrase, not because parts of it aren't worthy of your attention or unclear, but because I don't want to prejudice your perception of its accuracy. It is aimed at a North American audience, but I believe it also relates well to us in the Antipodes. The antithesis of vigilance is heedlessness. When ideologies like socialism can sneak in without much attention, socialism creates global conditions that bring great stress and trouble, difficult days that will be hard to bear, and it demands a one-world system of government. If this pandemic had been worse than it has been, you would have probably seen more of it than you've seen already. I believe there are 10 phenomena we are witnessing today, and seeing our circumstances in light of these should give us resolve, purpose, and hope, and help us answer the questions: what are we to do with the world around us? What hope do we have in times like these? And ultimately, where do we go from here? Are the public cries for shared wealth and government control a sign many of the troubles we're seeing today in our culture can be tied to the growing foothold of specific ideologies? Under the cover of darkness, a middle-aged man inched out of the window of his 7th-story apartment and then silently rappelled 75 feet to the ground. A pair of bolt cutters snipped off his ankle monitor, and the man jumped into a waiting car. No, this is not a movie. After 15 years of imprisonment on bogus charges, Ivan Somonovich was escaping from Venezuela. In 2014, Ivan had been moved to house arrest to seek treatment for 19 chronic health conditions, most of which had been caused by his imprisonment. Knowing this was his only chance, he arranged his daring escape, and after speeding off in a car, he spent 3 weeks evading security in a cat-and-mouse pursuit. A 14-hour ride in a small fishing boat got him to a Caribbean island, and from there he flew to the United States. Ivan could recall when Venezuela was the wealthiest nation in South America. The per capita income of its citizens was greater than those of China and Japan, almost rivaling the income of US citizens. The people of Ivan's generation enjoyed religious liberty and political freedom, and personal dignity and economic opportunity. But when the oil prices crashed in the 1980s, and then again in the 90s, the Venezuelan economy experienced a dip. And that dip then became a dive. In 1998, the Venezuelan people elected Hugo Chavez as their president. Once in power, Chavez relentlessly implemented the socialist playbook, formulated by the Soviet Union, Cuba, and China, and other nations. His first task was to rewrite the Venezuelan constitution, guaranteeing citizens the so-called free rights of government-provided health care, free college education, and social justice. When the Supreme Court ruled against Chavez on several important issues, he responded by stacking the court with 12 new justices, all of which were loyal to him. Socialism totally engulfed the country. When Chavez was re-elected in 2006, fully in control of the courts and the legislature, he moved quickly to nationalize the media, removing every voice of dissent. Then he authorized government agencies to seize privately owned wealth and property from Venezuela's citizens, all in the name of fairness and equity. Chavez took control of the nation's oil industry. He expelled all the foreign investors. He nationalized power companies and farms and mines and banks and grocery stores, and his final step was to eliminate term limits for elected officials, setting himself up to rule for the rest of his life in the style of Russia's Stalin and Cuba's Castro. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Not even Chavez could evade the last enemy. He died from cancer in 2013, but his hand-picked successor, Nicolas Maduro, continued to implement Chavez's agenda, even going further in some areas to force a Marxist system on the Venezuelan people. Today, Venezuela is descending into anarchy. Record numbers of Venezuelan immigrants are fleeing northwards, trying to reach the border of the United States right now. You may be wondering what all of this has to do with you. I mean, if Venezuela has proven that socialism is a bad idea, why should anybody care? Well, you should care. You should really care, because socialist visions and policies are invading the United States. You'll hear it discussed under 4 different names. Some people call it socialism, communism, Marxism, and cultural Marxism. Socialism seems to hold some sort of hypnotic power over many thinkers, and it's spilling into the common culture. A 2020 poll showed that 40% of Americans had a favourable view of socialism. This was up from 36% in 2019, and even more frightening, 47% of the millennials and 49% of Generation Z view socialism favourably. Indeed, one 2019 poll found in excess of 61% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 24 have a positive reaction to socialism. I put it to you that it's the same in this country. Heedlessness is a condition where people were so indifferent that they didn't understand what was happening until it was too late. The lessons of our world's history of heedlessness are repeatedly duplicated. Think of the Holocaust. Russia, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Rwanda, and lately Venezuela, and many others. Heedlessness means a day much like ours, a day when ideologies like socialism can sneak in without much attention. Will this be the political philosophy of New Zealand when the troubles really begin? What is socialism? Well, socialists believe that the world's means of production, like infrastructure, farms, factories, energy, natural resources, medicines, and more, should be under the control of, quote unquote, the people. In other words, society as a whole should own all the raw materials and all the wealth, all the systems that produce wealth. In a free market system, these materials are controlled by companies or individuals, but in socialist countries, they are owned by the people. Of course, there's not many ways to make decisions based on such a loose concept as the people. So under socialism, the government becomes the sole authority and controller of the means of production. Unfortunately, governments are controlled by specific people, often the kinds of people who seek out power, and those people are entirely corruptible by greed and selfishness, lust and vindictiveness, and violence and the overwhelming desire for power. As more power flows to the government, the handful at the top become dictatorial. To understand socialism as it is in our culture today, we must first understand the originator of socialism. As we know, he was a man by the name of Karl Marx. When you understand who he was and what he believed, you'll be able to trace a lot that's going on in our world today right back to him. If you study the life of Karl Marx, his family thought he was possessed by a demon. Karl Marx died in despair on March 14, 1883. Just before his death, he wrote to his friend Engels, "How pointless and empty is life," he said, "and yet how desirable." He was buried in the Highgate Cemetery in London. Today, Karl Marx is ruling the world from his grave. And here are some of the characteristics of his ideology. Number one, Marxism is anti-God. Karl Marx hated Christianity, which he saw as a source of oppression to him. Religion was the opium of the people. For communism to succeed, loyalty to the church had to be replaced by loyalty to the state. On one occasion, he described the church as medieval mildew that had to be scraped away. In spite of what many claim to believe or propose, Marxism is incompatible with the free expression of religion. One of their little sayings was, "We're going to get rid of the world of capitalists and rid heaven of God." That was their motive. It is also characterized by totalitarianism. That's a long word, but it's a word you'll understand in a moment. This fact about Marxism is one we should grasp. It quickly becomes totalitarian. The term totalitarianism was first used by supporters of dictator Benito Mussolini, who summed it up this way: everything within the state, nothing outside the state, and nothing against the state. It's totalitarian and it's divisive. Marxism thrives on division. In historic Marxism, the division was promoted between classes of people: the oppressors against the oppressed, the bosses against the workers. Men like Hugo Chavez went out of their way to ensure that the poor people of his country hated the wealthy people of his country. In today's cultural Marxism in our country, the exploited divide is often racial. I believe that's one of the reasons we've lost some of the progress we've made on race relationships. Whatever it is, or however far it might be removed from actual racism, whenever a socialist or Marxist can't figure out how to respond to an issue, they always, and I mean every time, call it racist. All of us know there are still issues that need to be addressed with race relationships in America, and that's true of this country. But the true issues get lost in the avalanche of unwarranted accusations, and there's never any time to devote to the real issues that still face us. When everything is racist, then nothing is racist. Now I want to unpack that a little bit. What does he mean here? It's similar to the practical outcome of believing that all ideas are equally true, even true for those that hold a different and opposite truth to you. When everything is true, or at least upheld as true, then nothing is true, because it devalues and undermines real, objectively true truth. In the same way, when everything and everyone is subject to the term racist, true racism gets obscured, confused, and real racism gets lost in the maelstrom of confusion. Marxism is using this divide in our country to make headway into our culture. Perhaps the most surprising thing about Marxism to me, as I studied it, is how deadly it's been. Marxism leads to death. In 1999, the Black Book of Communism endeavoured to attempt the impossible task of tabulating a Marxist-Leninist death toll for the 20th century. It has revealed the most colossal case of political carnage in history. Latin America, 150,000 deaths. Eastern Europe, 1 million deaths. Vietnam, 1 million deaths. Africa, 1.7 million deaths. Cambodia, 2 million deaths. North Korea, 2 million deaths. The USSR, 20 million deaths. And I believe that is conservative. if you don't take into account the government policy-induced famines that Russia suffered as well, which would have added many more millions. China, 65 million deaths. Communism leads to death wherever you see it across the globe. You will see the deadliness of it. That's all from the heart of Karl Marx. So that's what it is, and obviously there's much more to socialism than what I've said. These are some of the main characteristics. You say, well, Dr. Jeremiah, that's a good study, so what does that have to do with us? What does that mean? Well, I'm afraid this new political trajectory in our nation is more than just a trend. It's a seismic shift towards the socialist agenda. If you look closely, you can draw the connections. First of all, the destruction of our monuments. It's become common in recent years to see news headlines or live video of protest groups surrounding, defacing, even eventually removing statues and other historical monuments they consider to be offensive. When we witness these events, we're not simply seeing a bunch of rowdy young people tearing down statues for fun. No, instead this is part of a concerted effort to erase the past. The first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory, destroy its books, its culture, its history. Then have someone write new books, manufacture a new culture, invent a new history. And before long, the nation will forget what it is and what it was. On the contrary, we honour our fallen every year on Anzac Day with the words, lest we forget. Yet socialism wants you to forget. Remember the former things of old. Remember the tragedies of the past so that we will not repeat them. The destruction of monuments is related to the socialist agenda. Cancel culture. Remember what I told you about socialism? It's totalitarian. Don't think it's just statues and histories that are being torn down. It's also anyone who doesn't kneel at the altar of prevailing political passions. You are cancelled. If you don't agree, I want to point out that this too is a child of socialism. In cultural Marxism, there's no room for dissenting opinions. Are we seeing that? Absolutely. Number 3, the dismantling of the nuclear family. Marxism reaches its icy fingers into your very home. Marxists want to raise your children. They want to do it. Not you, they want to do it. That's what's going on in our schools today. They want to pull all of this insidious craziness into the curriculum starting now, earlier and earlier in school. The cancel culture, the dismantling of the nuclear family. And how about this? The redistribution of wealth. That's the central thing that most people know about socialism. This ideology teaches that all human assets should be claimed by the government and redistributed to the masses in a more equitable formula. This would supposedly rid the world of poverty, but somehow it's never worked out that way. There is not one single successful socialist story. They are all failures. They all lead to death and destruction and poverty. And don't give me the Scandinavian countries as an illustration, because they're not socialists. Those are welfare societies. Socialism fails, socialism is death. Socialism will lead this country to destruction, and everything it was built on, everything we believe, will be destroyed if we don't stop this in its tracks. Here's one that really makes sense: the defunding of the police. Socialists are especially keen on keeping the reins of law enforcement in their tight fists. In America, their first step is to villainize the police, then to defund them. And that's why some cities have slashed their police budgets. And surprise, each of these cities has seen a dramatic uptick in violent crimes in all the months that followed. Who could have thought? Whatever you do, don't miss the socialist motivation for vilifying local authorities. No matter how loudly they deny it, they are simply trying to let the local government fail so that they can federalise our cities and states and move control for all that happens to Washington or Wellington. It's all about the centralising of powers and focusing it on the elite few. Everything you watch today is about nationalising elections, nationalising schools, nationalising everything. Nationalise it, then you can control it with just an elite few. So that's where we are, that's where we've been. And here we come to this question. Where do we go from here? You say, Dr. Jeremiah, I'm just one little one. What am I supposed to do about all this? How can I have any response? I mean, this is coming, I see it and I feel it, and it touches my children and my grandchildren. So what should I do? Well, let me give you some thoughts that I hope you would carefully consider. First of all, we need to review what has sustained our culture in the past and given us so much up to this point, and reaffirm those values, the sorts of concepts, the ideas and the institutions that have given this country a wonderful start and will continue to reward us with a stable, fair and just society, and indeed improve upon these if we look in the right direction. We ought to applaud and value the dignity of work, and indeed that the workman is worthy of his wages. His or her labours are essential to national prosperity, and just as important are those that create the conditions that make work, employment, both possible and necessary. The wealth creators, entrepreneurs, businesses, industries, and the rewards that come with the hard work, the risks, and the responsibilities of employing others is the justification for the profit motive. We must again affirm the rightness of enjoying, celebrating private property. We condemn theft of the baser sort and the state-sanctioned theft of private property. We must condemn a sense of entitlement, and to use an old-fashioned word, covetousness, jealousy over other people's wealth. At the same time, we affirm and encourage the conditions that enable many people to aspire to greater wealth and savings through thrift, hard work and investment. Land ownership and home ownership must remain or become more accessible as an achievable and realistic goal. That is a hallmark of freedom. Socialism contradicts every single one of those principles. Refuse to live by lies. So much of what we hear in our culture today has no connection to common sense. Let us refuse to live by lies just because somebody in power says it's true doesn't mean it's true. Gather in groups that support each other. Don't just sit on our hands when people are trying to steal from us the things that mean so much to us. Finally, I want you to remember Venezuela. That's where we started today. Venezuela is a social and economic wasteland. 96% of citizens live below the poverty line. Most people earn less than $1 per day. Poor economic management brought about inflation rates of more than 10 million%, which is why a roll of toilet paper costs 2.6 million bolivars, the Venezuelan currency. And the lack of investment in commodities means the nation is barren of essential medicines and medical services. As a result, an estimated 5.5 million refugees have fled Venezuela, a number that represents more than a sixth of the nation's total population. In short, a country once defined by freedom and opportunity is now oppressed, barren, and hopeless. And Marxism caused it. and I can vouch for at least some of the truth of this in some respects. I have two son-in-laws from South America, and they have told me virtually what is being written here. Marxism is amongst the worst ideas ever conceived. Just ask its oppressed multitudes and its countless casualties. We should be aware of its history, herald its dangers, and oppose its spread. When you see those crazy people on television, and I could name a few of them, talking about how this is going to be the new face of our nation, I hope you shudder as I do. So that was basically an edited version, some of it paraphrased, of an address given by Dr. David Jeremiah. And I'm pleased and honoured to have repeated and narrated it to you this evening, and I certainly hope you'll take heed of it. Thank you and good night.